Hi guys, and welcome to this tutorial where I show you how to paint lots of spring flowers. Many of the flowers are suitable for beginners. I really hope you're going to enjoy this tutorial. Let's get started. My first tutorial is going to be of a 4-stage step-by-step pansy tutorial. This is part of my sketchbook challenge. If you'd like to know more about the sketchbook challenge, check out the end of this tutorial where I actually go through all the paintings in my sketchbook. Let's get started. So as you can see there, I've mixed up some lemon yellow, you can use cadmium yellow pale, with some red, any red will do, to make an orangey colour. So I've mixed my colours first. I'm now painting the lemon yellow wet into wet with my size 14 brush, just at the top part here. And what happens when you paint wet in wet is you get a soft edge. So if you look at the outside bit of that yellow there, it's got a lovely soft edge, similar to the photograph. So I'm using this orange now, painting it damp into wet. What happens then, the paint doesn't run as quickly when you're painting a creamier paint into a wet paint. Another way of helping you with this is to wipe off, as you saw there, the excess paint on my brush, on my paper towel, and that ensures that your brush isn't too wet. I've mixed up a little bit of hooker's green here with the lemon yellow, and I'm just painting a little bit of limey green, damp into damp now, right in the centre there at the top. It's just a little minor detail, but it's really just to sort of paint the detail here, damp into damp. I've mixed up some violet colours using ultramarine and some permanent rose, and I'm wetting the right hand petal here, and I'm going to paint these colours wet into wet. Some have got a little bit more ultramarine in them and some have a little bit more pink. I'll put colour alternatives in the description below, but I'm making sure this petal is nicely soaked in so it gives me more time to paint wet into wet. So I'm painting in on the edge of the petal here a more pinky violet colour with my size 8 brush, wet into wet. As you saw there, I painted more of a violet colour, that's the ultramarine and the pink in equal quantities. And now I'm painting the violet colour that's got a little bit more ultramarine in, and it's a little bit more damp into wet there. And I'm blending those colours. So you've got that sort of pinky violet outside edge with the more bluey sort of violet colour in the middle and going towards the centre. And I'm using the tip of my brush just to finesse some details there. This is a cocktail stick, and I'm actually scratching into the damp surface there to create some thin dark lines, the veins of the petals. Now this is permanent, so if you don't want to do this because you can't remedy it afterwards or change it, you can actually use dark watercolour paint, wet on dry later on, which I will show you how to do. So I'm wetting the petal on the left here using my size 8 brush. The interesting thing is I haven't changed my water, so I've got quite a violet water in my water pots there, but it's actually been really useful because I've got this lovely pale violet underpainting, so I'm quite pleased with that. So don't rinse your water out unless it looks brown or muddy. So I'm painting this pinky violet wet into wet on the outside edge using my size 8 brush, and now I'm painting in slightly more of a bluey violet here in the centre, wet into wet, sort of pushing that colour onto the outside edge as well and blending as I go. I'm still using the same permanent rose and ultramarine. This is a slightly creamier colour. I've taken the excess off on my paper towel, and I'm painting damp into damp, some more sort of slightly darker blue violet marks here. And I am painting the top petals now in a paler colours, still using the same colours, the ultramarine and the permanent rose, still working wet into wet and damp into wet, but these colours are a lot paler, so I've got more water in them. And as you can see, I'm using the paper towel just to paint these very sort of faint lines here, markings on the pansy. So you've got these sort of rather strong petals in the middle, and these two top petals are a lot paler. So I'm painting quite a sort of strong violet in the centre here, and I've actually used some violet straight from the tube as well. That's quite a useful colour, and I've added a touch of pink in there, and I'm just blending it out with a clean damp brush, with my size 10 brush, and using the cocktail stick as well to create some thin dark lines. It's a good time now to allow your painting to dry, and I'm going to begin step 2, stage 2, painting dark marks wet on dry onto the more yellow petal here, using violet with some Payne's grey. You can make your own violet with the ultramarine and permanent rose, but I've actually used ready-made tube violet here, straight from the tube. I always squeeze out my watercolours into the pan, so they're all freshly squeezed paint now. Some of them are still the Sennelier paints where I bought this box originally, but I have replaced some of the colours with tube paint. So I'm painting using my size 4 brush now, just these sort of really distinctive characteristic marks of pansies. I'm just darkening up the centre here just to really sort of make that look like it's behind those two petals with some violet, and then softening and blending with a clean damp brush. I've watered down that violet colour and I'm painting those thin dark lines I spoke about earlier with my size 4 brush instead of using the cocktail stick. And it's just those identifying lines that you have on the pansy here that sort of brings it to life just with those darks and details. So it's a good time again to allow your painting to dry. Once your painting is dry, we can start stage 3. And what I'm doing here is I'm just adding a little bit of yellow just to the center here. I could see that in the photograph, just a little touch of yellow. And then I'm using a very watered down yellow for that white center there, so it's not completely white, so just a hint of yellow, and I blended with a clean damp brush. What I'm doing now is I'm using my size 10 brush and I'm wetting very gently this bottom petal here. I don't want that dark purple or the yellow to lift. Now in watercolour we use soft brushes, and the reason why we do that so it doesn't disturb the paint underneath, because watercolour isn't permanent. And the reason why I'm wetting it, again, I want a soft edge. So I'm dropping in that gorgeous sort of pinky violet colour, that's the pink first with a touch of blue, using my size 10 brush, painting wet into wet. And you can see really using the tip of the brush there, sort of around the edge of that petal there. It really does bring this pansy to life. As you can see there, I added a little bit more ultramarine to that pink as well, and the paint that I'm mixing up here is very creamy, so it doesn't run as much. And I'm putting this dark right at the bottom there to really kind of make it look characteristically like a pansy, blending as I go, painting around the edge here as well, rinsing my brush, taking the excess off on the paper towel and just blending that so you don't get any hard edges. So I'm just adding a little bit more dark to the centre here. It's ultramarine and yellow, any yellow will do, with my size 4 brush. It's just to really sort of make that centre pop, more so than the photograph. Now you can leave your painting here, or you can paint a background. So it's a good idea, again, to allow your painting to dry. So I'm going to paint the 4th and final stage. And what I'm doing is I'm wetting the background. I'm just going to give it a background, just sort of similar to the photograph, but even more sort of subtle. So I've got a very, very pale violet here, really watered down, and I'm painting this wet into wet. So I've wet my background and I'm using my size 10 brush and just dropping in this violet colour. Rinsed my brush and I'm just painting a very watered down ultramarine and yellow green. It's a mid green, and I'm just sort of using that in between that violet there. So I don't want to touch the violet. I want to just paint that green around the violet and let the wet in wet, let them blend together naturally without me pushing the paint in with my brush. That way you don't get any muddiness. Sometimes when you mix violet and green together, you'll get a very sort of muddy grey colour. I thought I'd add a little bit more of a yellow green. That's yellow with a little bit of ultramarine, just to brighten up that background slightly. You don't have to do this, and you don't have to paint the background actually, but that's damp into wet there, just where the green wash is. Avoid painting over the violet colour. I'm using a little bit of table salt now and sprinkling it on the damp background. What that will do is absorb the paint to create some lovely light textured effects. Let that dry naturally. And here is the painting dried, and you can see it's very subtle background, and the salt has created some lovely wild flowers in the distance. My second tutorial is going to be of 2 Primroses paintings using different styles. So I'm just starting off here with a little bit of green from my SCHMINCKE art box, but you could use something like phthalo green or phthalo blue with a touch of yellow. And I'm dropping in now some cerulean. Again, you could use something like Prussian blue or phthalo turquoise, anything yummy like that. And I'm using my size 10 brush, and I'm working wet on dry, but dropping the colours in wet on wet. I've just sprinkled a little bit of salt in there, and I'm going to see what happens. I'm painting the centres in now wet on dry, using my size 6 brush with the sort of a lighter yellow and a deeper yellow, so you could use lemon yellow and cadmium yellow. And I'm actually going to use some of the brush show now, and this is lemon, a colour lemon, and it comes in a large pot or small pots, or you can put it in your own containers. And I'm just using an old brush, a dry brush, and just sort of dusting it onto the wet surface, and it creates these lovely sort of intense effects. It's such a nice sort of medium, and I've just sort of put a little bit more on there now, and I'm going to use my spritzer bottle and just spray the brush show as well, which can be quite effective. And this is not necessarily a tutorial on brush show, but it's just to show you a little bit about brush show. I may do a more in-depth one later. As you can see, it's spreading there. I'm wetting this left hand side sketch, and I'll be doing a little bit more brush show on this side. The right side's a bit more traditional, well, more my techniques. And I've mixed up some cerulean and some pink, and I'm painting this with my size 10 brush, wet into wet. And I'm going to sprinkle some brush show in a smaller pot. The more regular pots it comes in, I've actually pierced a little hole in the top of it, and it's like a little bit of salt, and I'm just shaking it out onto the wet surface, and you can see it creates some magical effects. I've done this with a little bit of Prussian blue down here, and I'm spritzing it, and again using this dry brush, that means the brush is not wet, and just sprinkling the powder on top of the wet surface, and just see what happens. It's so magical, it really is. I'm doing the same in the center of the primrose here as well, tapping my brush and, you know, getting the brush onto the wet surface. I've wet the right hand side here as well. I'm sprinkling a little bit of the violet on here, sort of dry into wet, and it just sort of dissolves. It's really yummy. It's such a really nice medium to use. It is quite messy, just a little warning, and some of the colours do dye your fingertips almost. It does come off, but just be warned, if you don't like that, do wear some gloves. And I'm just spritzing now all these colours for them to blend together. Obviously, when I'm doing this, the petals get wet as well, but I've got a little answer for that later, so watch out towards the end of this tutorial. I'm now painting in wet on dry some details on the right hand primroses, using some yellows and now some shadows in between the petals, and blending with a damp brush and just building up the detail. And the dark background of the paint really brings these primroses to life. You've got this lovely dark against light, and I'm just painting some little shadow colours on the petals, wet on dry, using a very, very dilute sort of watered down pink or red with a touch of green. If you'd like to watch a more in-depth tutorial, remember, check out my Patreon membership. The link for that can be found in the top right hand corner or in the description below. And I'm just now painting again the shadows on the more sort of looser primroses here, and using the same sort of effect. You saw there some of the brush show got on the petals, so it does reawaken it and you get more of a purple wash. And it's quite fun though, you know, you get these different sort of effects. And I'm just sort of building up some of the shadows and details on these petals. So the painting has dried here, and I'm using my size 6 brush with a very sort of dark cerulean with some Payne's grey mixed with it, but you could use indigo and Prussian blue, something to create a yummy dark. And I'm just painting around the edge of the primroses now. Even though the brush show has sort of run onto the edge there, I'm actually reverting back to my original drawing, so I've got that dark against light, so it's quite magical, so that you've got that soft green and yellow still remaining on the petals, and it's really effective. And I'm just, there's a little lump of brush show there, and I just blended it away. I'm using Quinacridone Gold here, one of my favourite colours at the moment. But I'm painting this as well, just forming the sort of shape of the primrose, working wet on dry. It's so much fun painting this style when you're sketching, because you can just let go and just feel relaxed. I'm giving a little spatter as well of some warm sort of yellow with a touch of red. I'm just finding another petal here that was lost in the background brush show, and you can still bring things back. That's the wonderful thing about watercolor. I'm developing this right hand side primroses now, just building up some darks here and there using my size 4 brush with a mixture of red and green, really diluted. You've got this beautiful neutral color. Remember, in watercolor, less is more, especially when you're using your sketchbooks and things. Don't get bogged down with the details. Just enjoy, that flow and the beauty of watercolor. So I'm just building up some of the darks in my background now using my size 10 brush with a mix of cerulean and Payne's grey. I'm glazing this on now. It's a very thin wash, but it just gives that background a little bit more sort of contrast between the petals and the background, just to really bring those flowers forward. And I'm just softening some of those petals as well with a dilute brush. I decided to put some stems in here on the left hand side. It felt a little bit like the flowers were floating. It may not necessarily be something you have to do in your painting, and I'm just building up a little bit of darks there on the left hand side. I'm removing my framing tape now to reveal a lovely white border, and it also gives me a chance to assess to see whether I need to do any more little sort of tweaks to my painting. I decided to give a little bit of spatter of some white gouache to the background to finish off. My third tutorial is going to be of some simple crocuses. I've sketched out my drawing. I've used an HB pencil on 300 grams cold pressed paper. The outline sketch for this tutorial is available on my Patreon membership. I'm using ultramarine and some opera rose. You could use cobalt blue and permanent rose. A blue and a pink will be perfect for this. I've mixed them together to create this lovely violet colour. I'm using my size 6 brush and I'm painting wet on dry. Water is my friend here, so I'm dropping in water as well to make the paint lighter. The more pigment you add, the darker the wash. The more water you add, the lighter the wash. I've actually swapped now to my large size 14 brush for these larger petals here on the left, working wet on dry. I'm trying to create some variety in the colours, so sometimes I'll use a little bit more pink and sometimes I'll use a little bit more blue, and I'll drop in water. But this first layer, we want it nice and pale, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my size 6 brush and drop in some creamier paint just to create some soft edges and slightly darker marks, as what I'm doing now, sort of just dropping in. So the paint hasn't got as much water in it, so I'm painting damp into wet. So the surface is wet, but my brush isn't as wet. And I'm just adding a touch more sort of darker marks at the top of the crocuses here, damp into damp, just to create a little bit more detail there. So I've dried off my painting now and I've wet the background. I'm mixing up a yellow wash here with some Quinacridone gold. You can use any yellow, and if you don't have Quinacridone gold, you could use raw sienna or yellow ochre. I'm using really expressive brush marks just to get some sort of movement in the background there, but basically I just want to avoid painting on top of the crocuses. I've added a little tiny bit of pink now to my yellow to make it more of an orangey colour. To be quite honest, you could paint any sort of background colour. You could have some blue sky and some green grasses. I've actually mixed up some ultramarine with some yellow here, using my size 6 brush, painting wet into wet the grasses just to get the detail there. And I'm using my size 6 brush to put a slightly creamier orange colour now. That's the pink and the yellow, just cutting in around the edges of the crocus to really bring them out. I'm sprinkling now some sea salt. You could use table salt on top of the painting, and it's damp, it's not too wet, and I've allowed it to dry naturally. As you can see here, it creates lovely effects. So my painting is completely dry, and I'm building up now some stronger tones on the crocuses using my size 6 brush with a mixture of the ultramarine and the pink. Now, just to say, look how much stronger that is because I'm using less water and more pigment. So I'm going to paint each petal now using the mixture of the ultramarine and the opera rose, working my way round to build up these midtones on the crocuses. A really nice technique in watercolour is to use watercolour pencils, and I'm using an emery board here. You could use sandpaper, and it's just to rub the pencil tip against the emery board or sandpaper, and the pigment falls off onto the damp paper and it creates some lovely textures. So I'm building up now the grasses wet on dry using my size 6 brush with a mixture of the yellow and ultramarine. It's quite a sort of a yellowy green here, and just sort of press down and lift up as you're painting these grasses to get the sort of very thin pointy edge at the top there is quite helpful. What I'm doing now is the painting is dry, the crocuses are dry, so I'm just building up now. I finish up with watercolours with darks and details, and I'm just softening the edges here and there. So I paint down the dark and then use a damp clean brush to soften and push back a little bit to finish off the crocuses. Just giving my painting a little spatter here with my size 6 brush with a mixture of the ultramarine and some yellow. It's quite a darkish green and it just gives a bit of texture, but it also stops me from fiddling with my painting. Remembering watercolour, less is more. I'm using some white gouache now. You could use white watercolour paint, and it's just to introduce some light on the edges of the petals. I didn't use masking fluid here, and actually white paint's really useful at the end of a watercolour painting. If you do lose some of your lights, those little highlights, sometimes we get carried away in watercolour. So never fear, gouache is here. So here is my finished painting. I really hope you've enjoyed this step-by-step tutorial. It's really a lovely one to do because it's quite simple, just building up those layers, maybe just 3 layers, light, medium and dark tones. You've got that lovely atmospheric background with the wet on wet washes and the salt and just those grasses, couple of layers of light and mid and dark toned grasses with a spatter to finish off. I hope you're enjoying this tutorial, and I just wanted to stop here just to tell you a little bit about my Patreon membership. It's a way of supporting the content that I create here on YouTube, and it gives you access to outline drawings and downloadable PDF documents with progress photographs to help you on your watercolour journey. I'm going to show you now some of the benefits of my Patreon membership. Let's take a look. So here I have over 180 exclusive tutorials. Just scrolling here, you can see a variety of subjects, different styles, and also different techniques as well to get you started in watercolour. I've got collections for beginners, improvers and advanced, my photo and painting challenge, my landscapes and seascapes, abstracts, flower painting, etc. As you can see, there are a variety of subject matters, techniques, etc. I specialise in landscapes, seascapes and flower painting, and I'm also known to paint abstracts and cityscapes, etc. So there's lots for you to choose from. On many of the videos, you can get access to a downloadable outline sketch for you to keep, and it will help you with your drawing. You will also have the opportunity to join my private Facebook group to share your work. You can also share your work on the Patreon app as well. It's a great sort of growing community of budding watercolour artists and very, very supportive of one another. And it's a great way of sort of learning and seeing how others are developing their work as well. You will also get access to over 150 watercolour beginner tutorials. And if you want to progress further, I have another tier available on my Patreon membership where you can get access to over 500 tutorials, and over 180 of them are exclusively available on the membership, and they are in-depth step-by-step tutorials. Many of the tutorials have downloadable PDF documents with progress photographs and step-by-step instructions to help you with your learning, and these have been made available from 2025. Here is an example of one of my PDFs. You've got the finished paintings, a list of materials and colours, etc., and then the step-by-step photographs with instructions to take you through the process of painting the picture along with the step-by-step video as well. So you can download this, print it and keep it for future use. So I really hope that tempts you to join my Patreon membership. All you need to do now is click Patreon in the description below. So back to the flower painting tutorials. My next tutorial is of daffodils. I'm just mixing up some yellows for the daffodils and I'm wetting my paper now. And I'm just putting on the light yellow. It's a lemon yellow. It's quite a sort of medium watery sort of wash. And I've actually speeded this up because there's a lot of painting in this YouTube video. So this is the lighter colour I'm putting on. And the other yellow I'm using is Winsor & Newton Cadmium yellow. And it's a little bit of a deeper yellow. So it just gives that lovely warmth to the daffodils. So I'm just using that colour now. So this is Wet in Wet. This yellow colour as well is slightly creamier than the previous colour, which is like the lemon yellow. So I'm putting it in Wet into Wet and I'm putting it where the colour's a little bit deeper and a little bit warmer. The brush that I'm using is a size 10 Winsor & Newton sable brush, but you can use any sort of anything from a size 6 to a size 12 or 14, whatever you feel comfortable using, but you want to be able to load the paint and put it on. If you notice, I'm back and forth with my brush all the time, getting fresh paint. So try to keep the paper, the surface of the painting, the same sort of consistency of wetness, if that makes any sense. So you don't want dry bits somewhere and it really puddly somewhere else. Try and keep it all consistent. So now I've just added a tiny bit of permanent rose to this cadmium yellow colour, and as you can see, it's quite creamy. I just want to make a really sort of rich orangey colour for the centre of the daffodils, and I'm painting carefully around the sort of centre bit there where I've drawn it. The paper is actually dry. I actually dried this in the sunshine, believe it or not, and not with my hairdryer. But sometimes it depends what the weather's like, and if I'm in my studio, I like to pop this out and let it dry naturally in the sunshine. So what I'm doing here is I've painted around the outside edge. I'm using water and I'm pushing it up into that sort of creamy wash. So what you'll get is a gradual sort of dark to light effect. So you get the light bit where the water is, and I'm just using the paint thick and creamy again, just around the edges. So I'm painting damp into wet. And I'm just putting that so you get that sort of dark outline edge of the centre, the trumpet bit of the daffodil. I'm going to repeat this now on the centre flower. I hope that you're finding this helpful. I'm really trying to take you through a step-by-step stage of what my process is when I'm watercolour painting. So I'm just again using this thick, creamy cadmium yellow plus a touch of permanent rose. You get a lovely natural looking orange, not too bright and sort of garish. I'm just painting this around the edge of this trumpet bit of the daffodil. Now I'm adding and pushing in water. I mean, the water is slightly orangey, but it is the colour that you're using in the painting, so it's okay. I mean, you don't want to be using water that's got green, washes of old green paint in it, because you're going to get a muddy colour in your painting. So it's always good to keep refreshing your water pot. I've really speeded up the film here. It's just to really show you lots of content in this video. And we'll be painting the rest of the petals now, wet on dry, just using the cadmium yellow and just painting the slightly darker, richer, colourful areas of each petal. So I've finished painting all the petals now, and I'm actually mixing up some delicious dark greens. I'm using Prussian blue with Quinacridone gold. I'm using some Cascade green from Daniel Smith. But the thing is, you just want to make dark green. So don't worry particularly about using the exact colours I'm using. Just try and make up your own green. So you could use Viridian with some burnt sienna or burnt umber. So that's how you get a lovely dark green, or Prussian blue with burnt umber. But it's nice to vary it. So this colour here is quite a medium dark green. So this is the Prussian blue with the Quinacridone gold. Now I've actually added, as you can see, a little bit more Prussian blue. If you want to make that even darker, add Payne's grey. It's always good just to sort of play around yourself with colour mixing. Don't worry too much about getting exactly right, because it's the background. It's quite abstract, and I'm just kind of varying my colours. So I've got some mid greens and dark greens. I have again speeded up the film here. It's just to again show you the whole entire painting. So it's a little bit faster than normal, but there's lots of little techniques I'd like to share with you still. I'm painting wet on wet because I've wet the surface with my large brush. It just gives me more time to paint large background areas. And then I'm painting in wet with the colours that I've mixed. And then with the slightly darker colours, it's slightly thicker paint and it's damp into damp. So again here, the surface of the paper is wet. I'm putting in strong dark colours, either wet into wet or damp into damp. And if you see to the left there, I've actually sprinkled some salt because it's dried off a bit. So when you've got large areas of background, it's good to sort of do section by section. Don't try to do the whole thing at once. So I've actually put salt there so that it does its, because if I was to put salt right at the end, that top left-hand corner would be absolutely dry. So do it piece by piece. So take your time. I find with watercolor painting, it's best to be prepared to sort of see things in advance. So when you see this video and watch this video, maybe even take some notes about what you might need, etc., on standby, so that you're not panicked and you're not rushed. I love what I'm doing now. It sounds a bit weird to sort of praise myself. I love painting in negative spaces. It really, look how it really makes that daffodil pop out just by putting that dark in. It's really, really magical. It just brings out that lovely yellow. It's almost like someone's put the lights on behind the daffodil. This colour I'm using here is Daniel Smith Cascade Green. I actually feel like I'm cheating with it because it creates these beautiful textured effects. I've actually got some of the Prussian blue in there as well, so it's not just that colour alone. I've put some salt on that top right-hand corner now. You can see it's starting to do something, but look at that top left-hand corner. Look at the salt. It's just wonderful. It's really lovely, the effect it creates. The other thing I'm going to do as well is I'm going to spatter my painting with clean water for those of you that don't want to use salt. So I completely understand if that's not for you. So there's other things you can do, and one of them is just to spatter water onto your damp painting. Don't do it on a wet painting because it'll just dissolve. The water will just it'll dissolve into each other. So as you can see here, I'm carrying on. I'm putting the darks in here. Just try to be careful. I mean, obviously I've got a nice pointed brush here. Take your time. Don't be rushed. My brush is quite big, but use a small brush if it makes you feel more comfortable. Just remember to keep loading it. Don't you sort of make the brush run out of paint, then load it. Always load your paint every 2 or 3 brush strokes. That's just a really good watercolor tip there for you. I've often said to my own students, 1, 2, 3, the 3 being load your brush. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So you might want to try that next time you're painting in watercolour. It's fun to do as well. Again, I've dried off my painting outside in the lovely sunshine, and I'm just brushing off all the salt. As you can see, some lovely texture there. And now I'm using the cadmium yellow with a little bit of the permanent rose, and I'm painting in some more darks on the top side of the trumpet of the daffodil. I'm going to push up some clean water up to the top there so you get a nice graduated shadow, and use the tip of the brush to create some marks. And I'm going to do that with each of the sort of interiors of the trumpet bits there. I've actually just added a little bit of quinacridone rust here on both those. Putting it in wet into wet, it just creates a little bit more shadow. If you don't have that colour, you could use burnt sienna. So I'm just going to paint on some shadow colours on the petals now, and I'm using that rust with some of the yellow just to create some shadows. You've got to be quite brave when you paint the shadows, so just go for it. The important thing is don't fiddle, paint it. Don't fiddle afterwards. Just trust the process. So I'm just painting this in using the tip of the brush, and maybe just then diluting and then just softening a little bit as well, and just going around each of the petals. I mean, I'm looking at the photograph and I just want to see where those darker bits are, and I'm just trying to emulate that with this colour. So I hope that's helpful. Remember, this is all wet on dry, and just soften as you go. So I would like to talk to you about these shadow colours, and I find actually mixing a pink and a green together, if you're unsure about shadow colours, creates a really good shadow colour. Tiny bit of pink. I'm going to add a little tiny bit of the green that I use for the background here. And what those two colours do, they're opposites on the colour circle, but what they do is they neutralise each other, and it's a really good way of painting shadow colours. And remember, these are the colours that you've used in your painting as well. And as you can see there, they're quite, they're not too scary. And I have really watered these down because yellow can look quite muddy. Yellow flowers can look very muddy if you overshadow them. So I'm kind of of really giving this a little bit less is more, because believe it or not, I'm a little bit scared too. I kind of want to be careful. I don't want to overwork these and end up looking like I've got daffodils that aren't yellow anymore. They're just sludge coloured. So I'm using my lovely dark green now, just using a bit of Payne's grey here and the original green that I had, the Prussian blue and the yellow. And I'm just putting in some stalks and stems and leaves. I'm adding a tiny bit more shadowy colour here. The painting, I've wet the surface of the centres here, and then I'm dropping that in wet in wet. I'm building up detail now. I'm getting towards the sort of business end of the painting. Just using the deeper cadmium yellow and just putting a few more marks, especially on the petals. I'm now giving the painting a little bit of a spatter just to give it a little bit of texture in the background. I've just used the cadmium yellow for this, watered down. I'm now making a really light green. I'm using the cadmium yellow to do this. It allows me to actually paint light colours on top of darks, because you're using a really light colour like cadmium yellow or lemon yellow will do it as well. I've actually added now a touch more of this quinacridone rust, wet in wet, to give some nice sort of darks to the centre of the daffodils. Just finishing off, just putting a bit more dark in the centres. This is the next day, and I'm putting in some more detail and darks in this daffodil. I'm using the quinacridone rust and yellow, and I'm painting this wet on dry, and it's just a few of the veins going through the trumpet area of the daffodils. I'm using that same sort of dark yellowish colour and just putting a little bit more detail around the right hand side of the trumpet part of the daffodils, and a little bit on the petals. I feel braver today. I had a good look at it yesterday, and I really felt it needed more. And of course, what about a bit more spattering? I'm just really cleaning my palette. I'm putting in a few more lighter leaves here just to give the background a little bit more interest. So here is the finished painting. I really hope it inspires you to have a go at painting these daffodils. Now on to the magnolias. I'm using a really simple colour palette. I'm using 4 colours: Ultramarine, Quinacridone Magenta and Hansa Yellow Light. And then I'm using Quinacridone Gold as well to get some more earthy tones. I've sketched out my magnolia with an HB pencil onto rough 300 grams watercolour paper, and I'm using my size 6 round brush, painting wet into wet, very, very light tonal values here, using the Quinacridone Magenta and lots of water. I've now mixed up some ultramarine and some Hansa Yellow Light to paint this very yellow green, and I'm painting this wet on dry, just tickling the paint on with my size 6 brush. I'm dropping wet into wet a little bit of the Quinacridone Gold, and I don't mind if it bleeds as well into the petals. It just creates some nice colours and textures. I've mixed up all 3 primary colours here, the Quinacridone Gold, Magenta and Ultramarine, to create this more neutral tone for the stems, and I'm just using some more yellow-green here, starting off wet on dry and then dropping in slightly warmer tones wet into wet. If you would like access to downloadable sketches, why not check out my Patreon membership? Details about that can be found in the description below. You'll also find longer versions with more voiceover and lots more discussion about technique and colour mixing. The tutorials are ad-free and you can cancel anytime. So I'm painting some of these magnolias wet on dry in the background, but they're very, very pale because they're the ones that are very fuzzy in the background. So it's to create a little bit of depth here, and I'm using the magenta and then a very pale grey green for the stems. So I've allowed my painting to dry, and I'm just working in the centre here using some of the magenta on its own, wet on dry, and then just pushing some water down into the centre here to create some nice darker tonal values. I'm just using my size 6 brush to also paint this vein going down the centre, and using my plastic card here to scratch into the watercolour paper to create some very thin vein lines. It's quite a nice way to get the details. Painting some very dilute greys there on the petals and building up some of the dark tonal values here, just using these three colours mixed. And it's so interesting, just using this limited palette you can get so much variety, again using the plastic card to create some really thin lines. Nice working with these really pretty colours. I've allowed my painting to dry. I'm using my size 14 brush. I've wet the background. I'm using Ultramarine on its own, wet into wet. It's quite pale and it's just really to represent this sky in the background and to keep it really almost semi-abstract, and just sort of dropping it in wet and wet, leaving little white gaps as well. I'm painting damp into damp now, a mixture of the ultramarine, a little bit of magenta, a bit of quinacridone gold, quite creamy. So you can see it's quite a nice, lush, creamy colour. I'm going to paint this damp into wet and damp into damp just to create these dark stems here and there. So I'm working on the left side. I haven't wet the right side, so it will give me time just to sort of, if I wet the whole thing, the other side will dry too quickly. So I'm just using some of the quinacridone gold, touch of pink, touch of blue to create this sort of just dark, earthy yellow colour, painting it wet in wet with my size 6 brush, trying not to touch the magnolia, of course, but just having fun painting around. And this is a very sort of dark colour now. So it's the ultramarine, quinacridone gold, quinacridone magenta, more ultramarine, and just painting it around this petal here to really bring out the light of the petal there, and using my size 6 brush, being very careful not to touch it, and just softening and blending as I go. So I've thrown a little bit of salt on the left hand side and I'm working on the right hand side. Very similar technique. Went on with the ultramarine first, then some earthy tones, some really bright yellow green as well, working wet into wet or damp into wet if you don't want it to run too quickly and blend in. And it's quite nice, that little bit of yellow there as well. Again, I'm going back around the magnolia using this very dark colour, and again just a reminder, it's a mixture of the ultramarine, a touch of magenta and a touch of the quinacridone gold, just blending as I go. It's such a nice way of painting backgrounds, this. It creates, it's almost blurry, so it pushes everything in the background back and brings the magnolia forward. And as you saw there, I painted around the magnolia, and that way you don't have to use masking fluid. You just paint around an object, you just wet around it. And if the background's wet, the magnolia is dry, it won't run onto the magnolia. So it's quite nice, and it's just nice not to have to use masking fluid. So I've allowed my painting to dry, and I'm actually going to work upside down so it's easier to get access to the top of the magnolia this way. I really want to bring it out without using obviously any masking fluid, but bring out that light of the watercolour paper by using dark tones in the background. So dark around the edges of the magnolia there, and then soften and blend with clean water. So it really pops that magnolia out there. Now, if you don't have masking fluid and you lose some of your light, you can use white gouache. I find that's the best. If you don't have white gouache, you can use white watercolour paint, white ink, or even white acrylic paint, or even pastels, actually, whatever you have to hand. But I'm just sort of bringing out some of the light edges here of the magnolia, and now I'm spattering a little bit now with white gouache mixed with a little touch of the pink just to finish off my painting. So here is the finished painting. I'm delighted with it. I really loved painting that background, the sort of fuzzy, soft, wet on wet sort of edges there, creating sort of depth, bringing that magnolia forward without the use of masking fluid. So I really hope you found it helpful and that it inspires you to have a go at maybe painting this magnolia or something similar. So for my last tutorial, I'm going to be painting some spring tulips. Let's take a look. So I have sketched out the 2 tulips into my sketchbook. It's a watercolour sketchbook. And I'm starting off with some Hansa Yellow Deep, making a puddle, and I'll add some water to it, and I'll start painting the red tulip first with the yellow at the bottom of the tulip. I'm working wet on dry with my size 8 brush, getting some more water, a little bit more yellow, and just adding some more yellow to the center petals and just pushing that yellow upwards and right to the tip of the petal there. I'm mixing up a little bit of bright red here and the yellow, and sort of pushing the red into the yellow, sort of wet into wet there, but just sort of really sort of having fun, just sort of painting with watercolour, not worrying too much here, still using my size 8 brush, really sort of loaded the brush with some red here. As you can see that paint travelling into the yellow there, so you get some beautiful effects here. What I quite like about this cold press sketching sort of watercolor paper is it's a little bit different from the paper I usually use, and I quite like it. You can see how I'm almost immediately getting backgrounds there, but I sort of quite like that for watercolor painting of flowers in this sketchbook. There's no pressure here. I can just play around and see what happens. So I've mixed up a little bit more of the bright red in here with a little puddle of water there, so it's quite watery. I'm sort of almost breaking all the rules here, doing all the things I tell you not to do. But when you're using a sketchbook, it's quite nice just to experiment. So I'm just dropping in a lot of really watery red paint there and letting it run down, so it's quite sort of brighter at the top there, and just working my way round to the right hand side here and coming downwards there, so it's quite pale. And I'm just getting a little bit more of the Indian yellow here, and it's slightly creamy, and just dropping it in wet into wet at the bottom of the tulip there, still using my size 8 brush. It's quite nice to have a simple composition like this, just 2 tulips, a couple of the top of the leaves there's no pressure, and it's great especially if you're starting out in watercolor or you've not really painted that many flowers. You can just play around in your sketchbook and you don't feel this sort of tightening up because it's a white piece of paper and you're worried about spoiling it. What I'm doing here is I'm just still using my size 8 brush, and I'm just dropping in alizarin crimson, which is a great sort of coolish dark red colour, which is great for painting shadow colours on red flowers. So I've mixed up a little bit of phthalo green light with a touch of the yellow there, and I'm painting the stem wet on dry, but I'm sort of touching the bottom of the tulip there, so some of that yellow has come down as well. So I'm painting the leaf now straight over the stem actually, because I'm going to actually paint some shadow on the stem later. So it's a lovely sort of bright green colour. This is a little bit of Daniel Smith's Green Appetite Genuine, because I've almost run out of my forest green there, and I love this colour, so it's quite a nice middle green tonally, so, and it creates some lovely textures. But if you don't have this, you can use something like sap green or make your own green using a little bit of ultramarine and yellow. And for those of you that would like a little bit of practice of mixing greens and learn a little bit more about mixing colours in watercolour, I'll put a link in the description below of a tutorial I made all about mixing greens, and also another tutorial about just colour mixing in general. So I hope you find that helpful. So I've mixed up some creamy Green Appetite Genuine here. Again, you can use sap green or hooker's green, and I'm painting it damp into damp with my size 8 brush. So that's the paint's quite creamy and the surface isn't too wet, but there's still a sheen on the surface. I've actually just dropped some water in there as well, so I'm hoping to get a little bit of a background there later. As you can see, I've got a background on the top left petal there, and that's where the wet wash or water is dropped into a drying wash, and that's when the shine of the paint is just about to disappear. I'm using a little bit of red here with my size 4 brush, and the paper has really dried quite quickly. It might be because it's thinner paper as well that I normally use, which is quite nice in a way, so I've not had to do any blow drying. So there's some damp parts, but I quite like it because there's some happy accents. But I painted a little bit of shading right in the middle of the tulip there with some bright red and a touch of alizarin. So I'm painting the right hand tulip now, painting some of the Indian yellow at the bottom. You can use cadmium yellow, and in the description below I'll have a full list of the colours that I've used in this tutorial with colour alternatives as well. So I'm just painting a little bit of that phthalo green light there, but you can use cerulean and yellow, and I'm actually using cobalt violet light, but you could use cerulean mixed with a touch of permanent rose for this gorgeous colour here. So I've applied it wet on dry, and I've just used a clean damp brush to blend it out a little. And now I'm using a little bit more of that cobalt violet light, and I'm just dropping that in to the sort of petal of the tulip there, wet on dry, but also in the damp areas as well. Just trying to vary the sort of tonal value. So where it's wet, it goes lighter, and where it's dry, it's slightly darker, because you're not diluting the paint as much. I'm also looking for a few happy accidents as well, because as you can see on that top left tulip now, the red tulip, you've got some lovely backgrounds, especially on the sort of left hand petal there, and it just brings a little bit of life and texture to the tulip, which I love. So I'm just continuing on here, just using this cobalt violet light. I'm using my size 8 brush still, and sort of working wet on dry, as I say, and a little bit of wet in places as well. As you saw there, I added some of the purple there, damp into damp on the sort of shadow side of the tulip there. It really is effective, and a little bit more of the cobalt violet light with the purple, painting sort of wet into wet at the top. You can see how it's all running down to create that lovely sort of effect. This is why I paint watercolour. I love all these magical effects. I'm using a little bit of green here, and it's really pretty much dried off at the bottom here. So I'm just painting some of that green Apatite Genuine wet on dry with my size 8 brush, just softening with a damp brush there to paint a little bit more dark at the bottom of that stem there. And I'm using a little bit more of that phthalo green light there, painting wet on dry the leaf in the middle, using my size 8 brush, trying not to touch the other leaves, leaving a little white sort of edge there. If you're worried about that, just allow each leaf to dry in between stages. But if you want to, and you let them touch, they sort of just bleed in together, and sometimes you get a nice background as well. So I'm mixing up a little bit of burnt sienna here with some viridian, which makes quite a nice colour mix, and I'm painting that damp into wet there with my size 8 brush, adding a touch of ultramarine here just to create a little bit more shadow on this leaf here. This is slightly creamier, so it's damp into wet here just to create this shadow at the edge of the leaf. And I've decided to do the same just on the leaf here, just to the left. So this is pretty much wet on dry. It has really dried off. This paper dries so quickly, which is quite nice for these little flower studies. Probably not if I was painting sort of a sky or something like that. I'll be running out of time, but it's lovely for this sort of sketching. So I'm just dropping in a little bit more of this dark, and as you can see, it's kind of the negative spaces here, and it brings out the positive shape of the stem. So it's quite nice. You're actually bringing this object forward, or the stem forward, by doing that. And I love using this dark colour here. I'm using it at the bottom as well, just to create some more dark here, wet on dry, rinsing my brush, taking the excess water off, and then just dropping in some water there just to soften that dark area there. I'm painting in this dark leaf to the right here, wet on dry, using some ultramarine and a touch of yellow, and just really trying to get a lovely fine point at the top there, really working at that there. I'm just painting a little bit of a light green wash here with my size 8 brush just behind the stem there, so it's just a little bit more yellow in the green, and I'm adding a little bit of the Phthalo cyanin blue here. It's a cold blue, you can use Prussian blue, with a touch of the Quinacridone gold or even burnt sienna, so you get a really lovely dark green. And I'm just painting this wet on dry with my size 8 brush, sort of just alongside this leaf in the middle here, so it's a really sort of dark leaf there. Really take your time when you're painting dark washes and don't be afraid of them. As you can see, my purple tulip is still wet. If you're worried about that bleeding onto the green, do allow it to dry first. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to mix the darks and the details. It's easy to overwork your watercolor painting, so really say to yourself, less is more. I'm using my size 4 brush. I'm using some of the purple, a little bit of that Phthalo cyanin blue, just to paint this dark. You can use Payne's grey as well with a bit of purple, and I've added a touch of the cobalt violet light here as well, just mixing it up where you've got this sort of dark light between the petals. So really take your time with these areas, it makes such a difference. And as you can see, I've added a little bit more of that cobalt violet light there as well, and just softening with a damp brush so it doesn't stand out too much, but you've got that tonal value there. I'm just softening here with my size 4 brush, adding a touch more of the violet on the left hand side here, and again adding lots and lots of water in the middle. What the water does, it pushes out those two colours and it really highlights them, and you get these like crisp edge, and it's got a little bit of tonal value there but also a nice thin dark edge, and it really separates the petals. So I'm just painting a little bit of orange at the bottom there using red and yellow, and I'm going to add a little bit more of the lemon yellow, pushing this creamy colour up into that orange, which is sort of shifting a little bit up into the violet colour as well. I'm using this limey sort of green colour, it's a phthalo green light with some yellow, and just sort of painting this at the top of the stem and just softening down the stem as well using my size 4 brush. So I've mixed up a little bit of the purple with the Phthalo cyanin blue, you can use Prussian blue, and I'm just painting this dark now wet on dry just to show some of the detailing on the tulip here. And I'm just painting a marks as well on the petal using this size 4 brush just to sort of bring it to life. There's a little bit of shading in the middle there as well, so I've painted that damp into damp. So I want to paint some dark reds here. So I'm using alizarin crimson with the bright red, and I'm just painting the top part of this tulip here where there's lots of darks and details. So I'm painting it wet on dry, and I'll just soften it here and there. It really is a case of less is more. You don't want to overdo it. Just let that watercolour shine as well, that underpainting. A little bit more bright red here just at the bottom. I'm using the paper towel to control the amount of paint on my brush. Sometimes you can have too much paint, you put it on and you just can panic, and this way you can control that amount of paint there. Again, I just sort of rinsed off my brush. I'm just using water to soften and dilute the paint as well. So I'm just painting a little bit of dark down the left hand side of the stem here using a little bit of the green Apatite Genuine, just softening again with a damp brush just to make sure I keep the light on the right hand side, and it just makes it look a little bit more round that way when you soften that edge. I'm just painting a little bit of the bright red now onto the surface of the left petal here with my size 8 brush, starting off wet on dry and then sort of diluting as well with water here and there just to sort of blend it back. I haven't gone for the really bright red tulip, I sort of gone for this sort of paler, sort of more orangey tulip as well. So you don't always have to copy the photograph exactly. Use it as a source, a reference and a source of inspiration. And I'm just dropping in some creamier red here again at the top just to show some shadow and details here with my size 8 brush. More damp into wet, so the surface is very wet still, but my paint is slightly thicker. And this is alizarin crimson now, so I'm really going for the darks on the left hand side, the light coming from the right, and just painting some of those marks on the petal, damp into damp, and just softening the bottom part here with a clean damp brush. Working on the right hand petal now, wet on dry to begin with a little bit of that bright red with my size 8 brush. It's quite dilute. I'm just really sort of looking at this sort of slight bit of shadow on the right petal here, and just sort of painting wet on dry and then softening with a damp brush there, just working my way down and actually really diluting towards the bottom to make sure it's paler. Just getting a little bit more, this is called French vermilion here, and just dropping this in wet into wet, looking for a few more of those happy accidents there, and just adding a little bit more red in again, wet into wet, just to finish off. A really good tip to stop you overworking your paintings is to sign and date them. That way you're kind of saying to yourself, I've finished, because sometimes it's so easy to be tempted to paint one more brush stroke, and before you know it, you're 30 minutes into your painting and you've lost your light. And that way it does help. However, it has given me time to assess to see if I need to do any more, and I felt this purple tulip was a little bit underpainted, not enough darks and details there. I think I forgot to paint the darks, so I'm just adding a little bit more here, wet on dry, then diluting with water and painting some dark on the left hand side of the stem to finish off my painting. And here is the finished painting. So I really hope it inspires you to have a go at painting these tulips. So I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial and that it inspires you to have a go at painting these spring flowers. If you're not going to paint directly from the photographs that I've used, you can use your own photographs and use the techniques that I've used. If you have any questions about this tutorial, please put them in the comments section below. If you would like to paint with me in person, I still have spaces on my watercolour retreat to Scotland, July this year. More details about the retreat can be found in the description below. And don't forget, if you want to support the content that I create here on YouTube, get access to exclusive tutorials and downloadable outline sketches, please click Patreon in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.